All right, so this is picking up where we left off on Wednesday. I hope you all enjoyed the incentive movie yesterday and today. I hope you did well in your quiz. So we're going to pick up with the collapse of the railroad boom, and I apologize because I'm going to have to be using my my mouse instead of the smart board, just because I can't be up at the board while I'm recording this. When we're talking about the collapse of the railroad boom, the one thing that I'm going to ask you to make note of is this point right here, and that is the overbuilding nationwide of railroads. There's a number of different factors, and some of them are listed there that you can sort of peruse on your own on your own time and on your own accord, and like the abuse of businessmen, the railroad businessmen who run the railroads, and also some of the different competition within wanting to buy and sell these railroads. But the biggest problem is the overbuilding of these railroads. And this is a problem that we see in a lot of different industries. For example, most recently, the housing bubble. You'll hear people talk about that, where there was, at one time here about 15 or 20 years ago, there was a huge push to build a lot of houses. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of money. There were a lot of people who were able to build these houses. And so it was, and there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of energy, and people sort of rode that wave. And what ended up happening is they created this massive bubble whereby people were getting money and were getting loans to be able to build all of these houses, but nobody actually had the money to be able to afford them. And so what ends up happening in that case is that you have the housing bubble, and that bubble eventually bursts. And that's what happens with the railroads. You have all this excitement, you have all this energy around railroads, and it's this new thing, and people are excited about it. And because of that, people ride that wave, and they ride that energy, and they build all of these different railroads, and then as a result, they sort of overbuild. And it's that bubble that really, it's the bursting of that bubble really that leads to the downfall of the railroad boom. At least that's probably the most noticeable reason for the downfall of the railroads. And so that kind of dispenses us of that. Now, some of the other inventions that are going to be very key are steel. And again, I apologize because this is a little bit out of order because you're going to want to talk about steel as replacing iron, okay? And hold off on that Bessemer process as you're writing out your notes here for just a second. Some of the reasons that steel is going to replace iron. Steel is stronger, it is more flexible, and it is lighter, okay? Now, if you're looking for a spot to put the Bessemer process, I would sort of put the Bessemer process underneath that, because that is the process by which steel is perfected. So the way that this works, and I'm not going to get into sort of the anatomical level of how this process works, but what happens is you take molten metal, iron, you then inject it with air, okay? And after you've injected that molten metal with air, what ends up happening is all of the impurities are burned off, okay? And when you have fewer impurities, you have less rust. You guys have heard me talk about my first truck, 1987 GMC Sonoma. I loved that truck. And one of the reasons that I had to unfortunately send that truck to the scrap heap was because it had rusted. And that's what happens with any type of metal product. In the case of steel, steel rusts less, and it takes longer for steel to rust if it is produced in the appropriate way. And that's what this Bessemer process is, was the injecting of air into this molten iron. And it was part of the reason that we had the railroad bubble, because it was great for railroad track. And it also helped in the advent of skyscrapers, these taller structures, and we'll get to those later when we start talking about immigration. The other thing is the typewriter. 1867, we see the invention of the typewriter. Prior to that, if you wanted to print something like a newspaper, or any type of pamphlet for distribution, you would have to have typeface, where you had small blocks that had the typeface letters on them. You would have to arrange them in the press, and then you would have to literally press the ink onto the page. Now you see the invention of the typewriter, whereby it makes typing letters and correspondence and newspapers and things like that much easier. So just some of the major inventions of this time period that were important, and we are not done with that either. Moving forward, we have Alexander Graham Bell, who is going to, I guess I can make that a little thicker, who is going to invent the telephone in 1867. We are all familiar with telephones. The initial telephone that Bell invents. The reason that I have the picture of Mr. Burns there, Mr. Burns, a character from The Simpsons. I was a big Simpsons fan growing up as a kid. And if you watched The Simpsons like I did as a kid, you will notice that when Mr. Burns answers the telephone, he says, "Ahoy!" And that is because that is what Alexander Graham Bell envisioned people using to answer the telephone. Ahoy is a term, as some of you will recognize, that is actually a shipping term of old. People on the high seas, that's the way that they would greet each other on the high seas. And so that's sort of the prism through which Bell saw the telephone was a communication tool, and that's the way that he knew how to communicate. And then also the electric light bulb, that's Thomas Edison. We'll also go ahead and underline that. Obvious reasons that the light bulb is important, but the one in terms of talking about production and things like that is this allows factories to stay open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because you don't have to worry about the dangers of having kerosene lanterns to light up the night. Those lanterns falling over and causing fires and whatnot. So the electric light bulb also obviously a very important invention of the time as well. Now, as we move forward, we're going to start getting into some more economic type issues. Before we get that, I forgot about the slide. The big thing here is the importance of oil. And it's worth noting that oil itself is important from the very beginning. Okay. Now oil has two byproducts. The first is kerosene. Okay. When you take oil, which is the picture that you see up here, when you take oil and you refine it, it goes through a process, and the first stage of that process produces kerosene. Kerosene is used to heat homes during this time. Now, today, when you think about heating homes, some of you in this area, you may heat with wood. That's the way that when I was a kid, we had a wood-burning stove in our basement. Some of you may do that as well. Some of you may have corn burners. That's a little less common, but nonetheless doable. Today, though, you probably use natural gas. You probably use LP. Or liquid propane. Didn't have liquid propane back then. We also didn't have the technology, in terms of having a wood burning stove, that was good for, cooking and things like that. But in terms of heating a whole house, wood burning was not the best option or the most efficient option. Back then you would have used coal. If you've ever read any pieces of British literature from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, if you read any of those pieces in the way that they described London, they described London as this very bleak, dreary, smoggy sort of place. And the reason is because they would have burned coal. Coal burned very, very hot, which made it a great thing to use to heat your home with. The downfall to that is that coal burns very, very dirty. Okay, there's a lot of byproducts that go into the air. And so that also happens to be the main source of heat here in America. Kerosene, as the first byproduct of the refining of oil, burns hot, but it also burns very clean. And so kerosene becomes the way that a lot of people are going to heat their homes. And then its later byproduct is gasoline. Okay, and gasoline is going to be a little slower to become important because we're not quite to car culture yet. We're going to get to that stage when we get to the 1900s and the 19-teens, but eventually gasoline is going to become important. So oil, it cannot be understated the importance of oil. And we're going to talk about sort of one of our robber barons or captains of industry we're going to talk about as being involved in the oil industry. Now, what we have talked about to this point, while important, it all leads up to this. And we will talk about this much later, but we're talking about some guys who historically have one of either two connotations, and that is they are either robber barons or they are captains of industry. Now, these two terms are used to describe the same people, and so it's very important to understand that, as you could imagine, robber baron is a very negative connotation. Someone who is a robber, someone who is a baron, that's something that's not good. And a captain of industry is something that's seen as being a little bit more positive. What you have to understand here is that Andrew Carnegie, which is the first name that we're going to sort of talk about, we've referenced Cornelius Vanderbilt. We're going to talk about John D. Rockefeller here in a minute. Whether you think these guys are robber barons, they're these terrible people, that negative connotation, or whether you think they're captains of industry, they're pioneers in the business world, these guys have a lot of money, okay? They are rich, all right? And that deserves to be pointed out and remembered. Now, what's important is not just that they are rich, but how they got to be rich, okay? Because they didn't necessarily start out that way. In the case of Andrew Carnegie, who is prevalent in the steel industry, okay, he is going to get to the point where he controls almost the entire steel industry. Not quite, but pretty close. He used this thing called vertical integration. And vertical integration is buying out your raw materials and supplies, okay? That is vertical integration. So, the example that we used in Sixth Hour yesterday is we were talking about pizza. If you think about what you need to make pizza, you need things like yeast and flour to make your dough. You need sauce. You need cheese. Cheese, by the way, is the most expensive ingredient on a pizza. You need your toppings. Okay. So you need a large number of products in order to make your final product. Well, what if instead of paying a company that produces yeast and paying a company that produces flour and paying a company that produces sauce, which are costs that you have to incur. You have to buy all of those things in order to make your final product to then sell to other people. And the price of each one of those goods, as dictated by each of those individual companies, dictates the final price that you can charge. Well, what if instead of having to be dictated to by another company, what if you just bought out all the companies that made all the things that you need? Well, you wouldn't have to pay them anymore because you would own them. And yes, you would have to incur the cost of what it takes to make those supplies. But at the end of the day, you're going to be in far better shape economically than you would have been had you actually had to pay a third person, a third party as it's called. That is vertical integration. I'm going to buy all of the steps in the process. All right. And that is what Carnegie is most noted for. Now, and I'm running out of time here because I've only got 15 minutes. His counterpart is a guy by the name of John D. Rockefeller. Okay, and that's who we're going to come to on the next slide. And Rockefeller is known for this thing called horizontal integration. Okay, so John D. Rockefeller, and this is the one where we're talking about the U.S. oil industry. He's gonna deal in horizontal integration, where you are buying out your competition in the same industry. So if we're talking about Papa John's Pizza, instead of buying all of the different things that I need to make my pizza to become more competitive, what if I just bought out Pizza Hut? And what if I just bought out Domino's and Little Caesars and so on and so forth? That is horizontal integration. Okay. Now we're going to stop there. We will continue this on Monday when we get back. So I hope you guys have a great day. I hope you did great on your quiz, and I hope you all have a great weekend. See you on Monday.